He once told her, "You've got the wrong address." 5 years later, the little girl with his eyes called him Daddy. Andrew Collins had built a life where no one dared challenge him. As the CEO of one of the most powerful corporations in the country, he was accustomed to decisions that changed markets and altered lives. People spoke his name with admiration or fear, never indifference. He had trained himself to see the world as a series of negotiations and risks, where emotions were liabilities that could topple even the strongest men. To outsiders, his steel blue eyes and sharp suits were symbols of success, but to those who looked more closely, they were a warning. This man allowed nothing and no one too close. It was into this fortress of control that Maggie stepped one evening, her courage shaking under the weight of what she carried but her resolve keeping her standing. She looked different from the women who normally orbited Andrew's world. Maggie had a natural grace that didn't need the armor of designer dresses or diamond jewelry. Her chestnut hair fell softly over her shoulders, and her large brown eyes, though tired, held an honesty he had once found disarming. But that was before he decided emotions had no place in his life. Now, as she stood in his office doorway, he felt only irritation at the disruption. He didn't even notice how tightly she clutched the strap of her purse or the way her knuckles whitened with nerves. She opened her mouth to speak, her voice trembling as she said his name, and in that fragile sound was a storm of fear, love, and hope all tangled together. When the words finally left her lips, telling him about the life growing inside her, Andrew felt the careful machinery of his world lurch for a moment. There was a flicker, an image of possibility, of change, of something that might have been called family if he had dared to dream that way. But the flicker was drowned almost instantly by the colder, sharper voice in his head that had always guided him. "This is weakness, this is distraction, this will destroy everything you've built." He straightened, his expression hardening, and he gave her the same look he had given to competitors and rivals, the one that left no room for argument. His words were low, clipped, and merciless. "You've got the wrong address." Maggie stared at him, unable to process what she had just heard. For a heartbeat, she thought she had misheard him, that the man she had once believed capable of kindness was still hidden somewhere behind those glacial eyes. But there was nothing there. The man in front of her had already turned away, already decided that her presence in his life was nothing but an error to be erased. The office, with its gleaming floor-to-ceiling windows and polished furniture, seemed to close in around her, suffocating in its perfection. She felt the sting of humiliation in her chest, but beneath it, something stronger stirred, a determination not to crumble in front of him. Her hand went to her belly almost instinctively, as though shielding the child from his rejection. She wanted to shout, to demand that he see her, see them, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, nodded once with a quiet dignity that surprised even her, and turned toward the door. Andrew didn't stop her. He didn't call her back. He simply watched as the door closed behind her, and in his silence was the final blow that told her she and the life she carried meant nothing in the empire he ruled. As Maggie stepped into the night air, her heart shattered into pieces, yet within the wreckage a single truth burned brighter than the rest. He might deny them, but she would not. She would raise this child, protect it, love it with every ounce of strength she had, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. Tears blurred her vision as she walked away, but with every step, she felt the first sparks of defiance growing inside her. Andrew Collins had closed his door and declared her mistake, but one day the world would show him just how wrong he had been. Maggie's life after that night became a test of endurance, one she had not chosen but one she refused to fail. She moved out of the small apartment she had once shared with a roommate and into a one-bedroom flat on the edge of the city where the rent was cheap, the walls were thin, and the sound of traffic never really faded. The space was modest, with peeling paint on the kitchen cabinets and a faucet that dripped at odd hours, but to her it was a sanctuary, a place where she could prepare for the child growing inside her without fear of being turned away again. She learned quickly that pregnancy was not gentle on the body, and there were nights when she curled up on her worn-out couch, clutching her stomach, whispering words of comfort to the little life inside as though the baby could hear and understand. She told her child stories about bravery, about survival, about love, because even if their father had turned his back, she would make sure this child knew they were wanted. Her days were long and heavy with exhaustion. Maggie worked at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where regulars ordered the same coffee every morning and where tips made the difference between paying the electric bill and going without. She hid her growing belly under loose sweaters at first, afraid that her boss would cut her hours once the pregnancy became too obvious. But as her body changed, so did the looks from customers, some sympathetic, some judgmental, some pitying, and Maggie forced herself to ignore them all. Every dollar she saved was carefully folded into an envelope she kept hidden in a drawer at home, money for diapers, clothes, and doctor visits. She denied herself every luxury, walking instead of taking the bus, eating the cheapest food she could find, all because she had sworn to herself that her child would never go without, no matter how much she had to sacrifice. At night, the loneliness pressed hardest. She remembered Andrew's words, sharp and cold, echoing in her mind like a cruel mantra, "You've got the wrong address." She tried to hate him, tried to push the memory of his face out of her thoughts, but sometimes when exhaustion overwhelmed her, she would close her eyes and imagine what it would have been like if he had chosen differently. She would picture him sitting beside her at a doctor's appointment, his large hand steadying hers, or waiting nervously outside a delivery room, ready to meet the child they had created together. The fantasies were fleeting, vanishing quickly under the weight of reality, but they left behind an ache she could never quite silence. She knew better than to hope. Hope was dangerous, and she had a child to protect. When the day of delivery came, Maggie faced it alone. The hospital room was bright and sterile, filled with the steady hum of machines and the brisk efficiency of nurses who had seen too many women arrive without anyone to hold their hand. The pain was sharp, tearing through her in waves, but Maggie bit down on every cry, clutching the sheets with white-knuckled fists, reminding herself over and over that this pain was temporary, that it was leading to something beautiful. Hours passed in a haze of sweat and tears until finally the cry of a newborn filled the room. Maggie turned her head, her vision blurred, and saw the tiny, wriggling form being placed in her arms. The world stopped. In that instant, all the fear, the rejection, the loneliness melted away. The baby had a tuft of dark hair and eyes that opened slowly, revealing the brightest, clearest blue Maggie had ever seen. They were Andrew's eyes, unmistakable, piercing, and for a moment her heart twisted with both love and sorrow. But when the baby's tiny fingers curled around hers, all of it faded into something stronger. She whispered the name she had chosen, Lily, letting the word carry her promise. "You are mine," she breathed, pressing her lips to her daughter's forehead. "And I will never leave you. Not ever." That night, as Lily slept beside her in the hospital crib, Maggie lay awake staring at the ceiling. She thought of Andrew again, of his empire, of his empty gaze when he had dismissed her, and for the first time, she felt no longing. She felt strength. He had chosen his world of glass and steel, but she had chosen hers, one built on love, sacrifice, and resilience. She would raise Lily not with bitterness, but with the kind of fierce devotion that could turn pain into power. Maggie knew the road ahead would be hard, filled with bills she wasn't sure she could pay and days when exhaustion would nearly break her, but as she looked at the sleeping child who already looked so much like the man who had rejected them, she made herself a vow. She would give Lily a life so full of love that one day, when fate brought their paths back together, Andrew Collins would see exactly what he had turned his back on, and regret it with every breath he took. The first months of Lily's life were a blur of sleepless nights, endless crying, and small moments of joy that stitched themselves into Maggie's heart like fragile threads holding her together. Maggie quickly learned that motherhood was not soft and romantic the way books sometimes described it. it was raw and demanding, a constant giving of herself with little rest in return. She woke every 2 hours to feed Lily, stumbling through the darkness of her tiny apartment with eyes heavy as stone, her body aching from the delivery and her mind fogged with exhaustion. Yet even in the darkest hours, when the world outside felt silent and empty, she would look down at the baby pressed against her chest, feel the steady rhythm of her daughter's breathing, and know without doubt that she had chosen the only path she could live with. The sacrifice was real, but so was the reward, and Lily's blue-eyed gaze was all the proof Maggie needed. Money was always a battle. Maggie returned to work at the cafe far sooner than her body was ready, leaving Lily in the care of a kind older neighbor who agreed to watch her for a few hours each day. Each paycheck barely covered rent, formula, and the endless stream of diapers and baby supplies, but Maggie became an expert at stretching every dollar until it screamed. She sewed tiny clothes from scraps given by a friend, bought second-hand toys at yard sales, and carried her daughter everywhere when she couldn't afford a stroller. Sometimes, when bills piled higher than she could manage, she sat at her kitchen table with her head in her hands, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. But every time Lily laughed, an unrestrained, bubbling sound that filled their little apartment with light, Maggie found the strength to keep going. The loneliness was a constant companion, creeping into the edges of her days. Friends from her past drifted away, too busy with their own lives to understand what it meant to raise a child alone. Men sometimes tried to approach her, but Maggie kept them at a distance, unwilling to risk exposing her daughter to anyone who wasn't fully committed. And in quiet moments, when she sat with Lily in her arms watching the sunlight filter through the thin curtains, she sometimes wondered if Andrew ever thought about them. Did he ever pause in his gleaming office, surrounded by wealth and power, and feel even the faintest echo of what he had lost? The thought haunted her, not because she wanted him back, but because she wanted him to know the truth, that he had turned his back on something far greater than the empire he worshipped. As Lily grew, her resemblance to Andrew became impossible to ignore. Strangers commented on her striking blue eyes, the way they seemed too intense for such a small child. Maggie often caught herself staring into those eyes, torn between anger and wonder. They reminded her of everything she had endured, yet they also reminded her of the strength that had carried her through. Lily was proof that Maggie had survived the rejection, proof that love could exist even in the shadow of cruelty. Each milestone, the first time Lily rolled over, her first unsteady steps across the worn carpet, the first time she called Mama with a voice that was both fragile and strong, was another victory Maggie claimed against the man who had once dismissed her as nothing. Still, there were moments when the weight of what she had lost pressed down hard. At Lily's second birthday, Maggie baked a small cake with her own hands, decorating it clumsily with cheap frosting, and invited the few neighbors who had become her support system. As they sang and Lily smeared frosting on her cheeks with innocent delight, Maggie smiled outwardly, but inside she felt the sting of absence. There should have been more laughter, more family, more hands clapping proudly for the child. There should have been a father who lifted her onto his shoulders, who kissed her forehead and promised to protect her forever. But there wasn't. There was only Maggie, who clapped louder and smiled brighter to make up for what was missing. Despite the hardship, Maggie discovered a resilience in herself she had never known. She learned to live on little sleep, to work double shifts when bills demanded it, to ignore the aching emptiness in her chest that whispered of what might have been. She carried Lily through sickness, through nights of fever when she held her close and prayed the child's small body would grow strong. She celebrated small victories, the first time Lily learned to count, the way she sang softly to her dolls, the way she kissed Maggie's cheek and whispered, "I love you, Mama." Those moments were her riches, her empire, and they mattered more than any wealth Andrew Collins could boast. Maggie did not know what the future held. She only knew that she had built a life from nothing, one stitched together by sacrifices no one saw, but shining with a love that could never be bought. And as she lay awake at night, watching her daughter sleep with those hauntingly familiar blue eyes closed in peace, Maggie promised again and again that Lily would never feel unwanted. No matter what, she would know she was cherished. And somewhere deep inside, Maggie believed that life had a way of forcing truth to the surface. One day, she thought, Andrew Collins would see those same eyes staring back at him and finally understand what he had lost. Andrew Collins had never allowed himself to dwell on the past. Regret, he told himself, was for men who had the luxury of weakness, and he had no such indulgence. His days were orchestrated to the minute, a relentless cycle of meetings, negotiations, and flights that left little space for silence. He lived in penthouses that glittered above the city like fortresses of glass, where the view stretched endlessly and the distance between himself and the world below grew wider with each passing year. Yet for all his victories, for every headline that called him ruthless or brilliant, there was a gnawing hollowness he could not quite banish. At night, when the lights dimmed and the champagne glasses were empty, Andrew often found himself staring into the darkness, a strange ache pressing at his chest. He told himself it was nothing more than exhaustion, but sometimes, when the silence grew heavy, he felt as though something vital had been severed from him long ago. His empire flourished, yet with every new acquisition, with every record-breaking quarter, he sensed the triumphs tasted a little less sweet. Associates celebrated with lavish parties and endless praise, but Andrew felt like a man walking through a hall of mirrors, his reflection multiplied but never whole. He avoided personal connections, dismissing relationships as distractions, and cycled through women who admired his wealth but never touched the deeper parts of him. No one dared to mention the word family in his presence. The idea of it had become almost laughable to him, and he buried it beneath layers of cynicism. Yet every so often, without warning, something pierced the armor, a fleeting glimpse of a child in an airport clinging to her father's hand, the sound of laughter from a park as he drove by in the back of a limousine, or the memory of chestnut hair and brown eyes standing in his office doorway years ago, whispering words he had silenced before they could root themselves in his heart. Andrew tried to bury that memory, but it returned unbidden in fragments, haunting him in ways he could not explain. He remembered the determined set of Maggie's shoulders as she turned away, the defiance in her silence that had somehow unsettled him more than her tears would have. At the time, he had thought himself victorious, firm in his decision to push her out, to keep his life untouched by complications. Yet with each passing year, the memory shifted shape. It no longer looked like strength but something uglier, cowardice, cruelty, a choice that had cost him more than he had allowed himself to admit. He never let the thought linger long, afraid of what it might unravel inside him, but no matter how he tried to silence it, it returned like a shadow he could not escape. It was during one of his rare evenings alone that the weight of it pressed hardest. He had just closed another deal, one that would secure his company's dominance for years to come. The city skyline shimmered beneath him, 1,000 lights reflecting his power, yet he felt no victory. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the glow of the chandelier, and for a moment he imagined another life. A smaller apartment, laughter echoing through its narrow halls, the chaos of toys scattered across the floor, the warmth of tiny arms around his neck. He could almost see it, almost believe it, and then he crushed the thought before it could take hold, reminding himself that such a life was not for him. Still, the emptiness remained, growing heavier with each passing night. The world saw Andrew Collins as untouchable, but inside he was a man unraveling in slow motion. His empire gave him everything he thought he wanted, yet the victories rang hollow, leaving only a gnawing hunger he could not name. He told himself it was ambition, the natural drive of a man who could never be satisfied, but deep down he knew better. Something was missing, something he had cast aside with a single sentence years ago, and though he did not yet understand the full cost of that choice, fate was already moving to confront him with it. And when it did, no amount of wealth, power, or arrogance would shield him from the truth waiting to strike at the very core of who he was. 5 years had passed since that night when Maggie walked away from Andrew's office carrying more than just the weight of his rejection. In those years her world had changed in ways she could never have imagined. Lily had grown into a spirited little girl, curious and bold, her blue eyes constantly widening with wonder at everything around her. She was quick to laugh, stubborn when she wanted something, and fearless in a way that both terrified and inspired her mother. Maggie worked tirelessly to provide for her, holding 2 jobs at times, saving every penny she could, but no matter how little they had, Lily never lacked love. Their apartment remained small, but Maggie decorated it with warmth, children's drawings taped to the fridge, a worn but comfortable couch, a second-hand bookshelf stacked with storybooks she read aloud each night. For Maggie, happiness was not measured in wealth but in the sound of her daughter's laughter and the peace of watching her sleep. The world, however, had a cruel way of weaving unexpected encounters into ordinary days. It happened on a Saturday evening when Maggie decided to treat Lily to dinner at a family-friendly restaurant in the city. They had saved for it all month, and Lily wore her favorite dress, a simple blue one that set off her eyes, while Maggie tied her dark hair back and smiled at her daughter's excitement. They sat near the window, sharing a plate of pasta, when the door opened, and a group of men in sharp suits walked in. Maggie barely noticed at first, too focused on cutting Lily's food into smaller bites, but then her breath caught. The tallest of them, with broad shoulders, perfectly styled dark hair, and those unmistakable blue eyes, entered the room with the air of a man used to owning it. It was Andrew. For a moment Maggie thought she must be imagining him, a cruel trick of her exhausted mind, but then he turned, scanning the restaurant, and his gaze locked on hers. Time collapsed. The years of distance, the nights of loneliness, the pain of rejection, all of it returned in an instant, slamming into her chest so hard she could hardly breathe. She wanted to grab Lily and run, to escape before he could come closer, but her daughter, curious as always, had already noticed the man staring at them. Lily tilted her head, studying him with a strange intensity, and then her small voice carried across the room, clear and undeniable, "Daddy." The sound froze Andrew in place. The conversations around them quieted, waiters paused mid-step, and Maggie's heart sank as every eye turned to their table. She wanted to disappear, to undo the moment, but it was too late. Andrew's face went pale, his carefully constructed composure faltering for the first time in years. The single word had cut through every wall he had built, striking something raw and unprotected inside him. He took a step forward, then another, his gaze locked on the child who looked so impossibly familiar. The blue of her eyes mirrored his own, her features carrying traces of him so clearly that denial was impossible. Maggie reached for Lily's hand, but her daughter was too fascinated, watching the man approach with innocent certainty. To her, the truth was obvious, undeniable, and she had voiced it without hesitation. Andrew stopped at their table, his towering frame casting a shadow across them. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the sound of Lily's fork clattering onto her plate. Maggie lifted her chin, summoning every ounce of strength she had, and looked him directly in the eyes. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was quiet but sharp, each word carrying the weight of years of pain. Andrew swallowed hard, struggling for words, his usual eloquence abandoned. "She's mine," he whispered hoarsely, his gaze never leaving Lily. Maggie almost laughed at the irony, the hypocrisy of the statement. "Now you see her," she said bitterly. "Now, when it's convenient, when the truth stares you in the face. But you turned your back when she was nothing more than a heartbeat. You don't get to claim her now." Lily looked between them, confused, sensing the tension she could not understand. Andrew's hands shook at his sides, his carefully constructed life crumbling under the weight of one small word spoken by a child he had never met. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. His money, his empire, his reputation meant nothing here. In this moment, none of it could shield him from the truth or from the devastation of realizing what he had lost. Maggie rose from her seat, lifting Lily into her arms, and turned to leave. Andrew tried to speak, but no words came. He stood frozen in the middle of the restaurant, watched by strangers, undone by a child's voice and the undeniable reflection of himself in her eyes. And as Maggie walked away, her daughter resting against her shoulder, he felt the world tilt beneath him, everything he thought he knew shifting into something terrifyingly unfamiliar. For years, he had told himself he needed nothing, but now he knew with painful clarity that he had already lost the one thing he could never replace. Andrew could not sleep after that night in the restaurant. He lay in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling while the city glittered below, but for once the lights held no comfort, no power. They only reminded him of the empty distance between his world and the one he had glimpsed in the face of a little girl who had called him daddy. Her voice echoed in his mind, shattering his composure, peeling away layers of arrogance he had worn like armor for years. He had thought himself untouchable, above regret, but now he could not breathe without remembering those eyes, the same shade of blue that stared back at him in the mirror every morning. His empire, once the only thing that mattered, felt hollow and fragile, like glass waiting to crack under the weight of truth. The next morning he tried to lose himself in work, but the numbers blurred and the conversations with executives felt meaningless. He dismissed meeting after meeting until his assistant, wide-eyed and confused, finally stopped asking questions. Andrew was a man who never faltered, but his mind was no longer in the boardroom. It was in a small apartment he had never seen, with a little girl he had never held, and a woman he had once told to disappear from his life. He realized with growing horror that he knew nothing about them, where they lived, how they survived, what kind of life they had built without him. The thought that Maggie had carried all of this alone, that she had raised Lily without his help, gnawed at him until he could no longer sit still. For the first time in years, he was afraid, not of failure in business, but of the possibility that it was already too late to make things right. Andrew found himself driving to the neighborhood where he had once known Maggie lived, though he had never bothered to visit back then. His car stood out against the cracked sidewalks and peeling paint of old buildings, but he hardly noticed. He parked, got out, and walked with a strange heaviness, scanning faces, hoping for a glimpse of hers. He didn't know what he would say if he found her, didn't know if she would even listen, but he needed to see her again, to try. For hours he wandered, the image of Lily's eyes burning in his mind, until finally he gave up and returned to his sterile, silent penthouse, defeated by the enormity of what he had lost. Meanwhile, Maggie had spent the days since the restaurant encounter in turmoil. She replayed the moment over and over, the look on Andrew's face when Lily had called him daddy, the shock that had broken through his carefully guarded exterior. Part of her wanted to shut him out forever, to protect her daughter from the pain of rejection she had known all too well. But another part, the quieter part she hated to acknowledge, whispered that maybe, just maybe, Lily deserved to know him, to choose for herself if she wanted him in her life. Maggie had built walls high enough to keep her own heart safe, but she could not deny that her daughter's innocent gaze had already reached through them. One evening, as Maggie tucked Lily into bed, the little girl asked the question Maggie had been dreading. "Mama, why did that man look at me like he knew me?" Maggie froze, her hands tightening on the blanket, her chest constricting with the weight of years of silence. Lily's eyes were wide, searching, demanding an answer. Maggie smoothed her daughter's hair and whispered, "Because he does know you, sweetheart. In a way." Lily tilted her head, confusion clouding her features, but she accepted the vague answer, drifting to sleep with her hand curled trustingly in her mother's. Maggie sat by her side long after, her heart breaking under the pressure of the truth she could no longer hide. Andrew, restless and desperate, reached out to an old mutual acquaintance who still kept in touch with Maggie. He didn't care how desperate it made him look. He needed to see her, to explain, to beg if necessary. Days later, he stood outside her apartment door, unsure if he had the right to knock. His hand hovered, shaking, before he finally forced himself to rap lightly against the wood. The door opened a crack, and Maggie's brown eyes, wary and tired, met his. For a moment neither spoke, the silence heavy with everything left unsaid. Then her voice, low and sharp, cut through. "You don't belong here." Andrew's throat tightened. "Please. Just a minute. Not for me. For her." His voice cracked on the last word, and Maggie's expression flickered with something he couldn't name. She stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind her, keeping him from seeing the life within. They stood in the dim hallway, two people bound by a history that felt like both a wound and a tether. "You don't get to walk in after 5 years and ask for forgiveness," she said coldly. "You made your choice." He nodded, his chest heavy. "I know. And it was the worst mistake of my life. But I can't undo it. All I can do is ask, let me try to know her. Let me try to be better now." Maggie's arms crossed over her chest, her jaw tight, but behind the hardness was exhaustion, the weight of carrying everything alone for so long. She studied him in silence, searching for cracks, for lies, for the man who had once shut her out. But what she saw instead was something new, a vulnerability in his eyes, raw and unguarded, that unsettled her more than his arrogance ever had. For the first time, she wondered if maybe he wasn't here to reclaim control, but to surrender it. She didn't answer, not yet. She turned away, leaving him standing alone in the hallway, but the door didn't slam shut this time. It lingered slightly ajar, as if the decision wasn't final. And for Andrew, that fragile crack of possibility was enough to keep him coming back, no matter how many times it took, until he earned a place in the life he had once thrown away. The days that followed became a test of patience and endurance for Andrew, a man who had never learned to wait for anything in his life. In business, he commanded instant obedience, but here he faced a woman who had every reason to distrust him and a little girl who did not yet understand the complexity of the ties that bound them. He returned to Maggie's apartment building again and again, sometimes standing in the hallway for hours just to catch a glimpse of her when she stepped out for groceries or to walk Lily to school. At first Maggie ignored him, her face set in stone, her hand clutching her daughter's as though shielding her from his presence. Yet Andrew did not retreat. He offered no excuses, only quiet persistence, a man stripped of his usual arrogance and forced into humility by the weight of what he had lost. One morning, Maggie found him waiting by the school gates where Lily skipped inside with a laugh that made his heart ache. Maggie's eyes narrowed when she saw him, but before she could speak, Lily turned back and called, "Mama, is he coming with us?" The question froze both adults in place. Andrew knelt down, meeting his daughter's gaze at eye level, his voice soft. "Only if your mama says it's okay." Lily looked at her mother expectantly, her small hand tugging at Maggie's. In that moment, Maggie saw how easily her daughter could love him, how naturally the bond between them formed without effort, and it terrified her. She didn't want Andrew's presence to become another wound if he walked away again. Yet she also couldn't deny Lily's right to know her father. Against her better judgment, she allowed him to join them for the walk home that day, her heart pounding with every step. Andrew tried to keep his words careful, his gestures small. He asked Lily about school, about her favorite games, listening with a focus that astonished even himself. He didn't try to charm her with gifts or promises. Instead, he seemed intent on learning who she was, piece by piece. Maggie watched from the corner of her eye, her skepticism slowly giving way to something more complicated. This was not the ruthless man who had once dismissed her with a sentence. This was someone undone, someone who looked at the little girl with awe as though she were the only thing that mattered in the world. And that terrified Maggie most of all, because she could see sincerity in him, and sincerity was dangerous, it threatened the walls she had built so carefully around her heart. Over the weeks, Andrew's presence became harder to push away. He began meeting them at the park, where Lily laughed as he pushed her higher on the swings than Maggie ever dared. He sat cross-legged on the grass, letting her braid his hair with plastic clips and ribbons, his laughter genuine in a way that startled Maggie every time. When Lily tugged him toward the ice cream stand, Andrew pulled out his wallet, but Maggie stopped him, her pride flaring. He didn't argue. Instead, he stepped back, letting her pay, his expression heavy with respect rather than superiority. She noticed it, and though she didn't say a word, something inside her shifted ever so slightly. Nights were the hardest for Andrew. After walking them home, he returned to his penthouse, its vast emptiness mocking him. He thought of Lily asleep in her small bed, Maggie reading a story beside her, and he realized with a sharp ache that no fortune, no empire, could compare to the life happening within those walls he had not been invited into. He longed to be part of it, to hear his daughter's voice in the morning, to feel her arms around his neck. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to want something money could not buy. Maggie wrestled with her own turmoil. She saw the way Lily blossomed with Andrew nearby, how her laughter grew louder, how her questions about fathers no longer carried quiet sadness. And Maggie, despite her fear, found herself watching Andrew differently. His hair was still neatly styled, his suits immaculate, but his eyes no longer shone with arrogance. They carried something raw, something unpolished, something almost pleading. She told herself she would not forgive him, not after what he had done. Yet every time she saw him kneel to tie Lily's shoes, or patiently listen to her rambling stories, or smile in that hesitant way that seemed to break his own heart, Maggie felt her certainty waver. The turning point came one rainy evening. Maggie and Lily were caught in a sudden downpour on their way home, and Andrew, waiting nearby with an umbrella, rushed to cover them. Lily squealed with delight, clinging to his hand, while Maggie stood stiff at his side. The rain soaked through their clothes, but under the umbrella there was a strange intimacy, as though the three of them existed in a world apart. Andrew glanced at Maggie, his voice low, almost breaking. "I don't deserve her. I don't deserve either of you. But if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to." Maggie said nothing, her throat tight, her mind torn between memory and the reality standing before her. She wanted to hate him, to remind herself of the man who had turned his back, but the one beside her now was different. He was no longer unreachable, no longer untouchable. He was simply a man, soaked to the bone, begging for a chance. And though she didn't give him an answer that night, she didn't pull away either. For Andrew, that silence was not rejection, it was hope, fragile but alive. The weeks that followed unfolded with a quiet intensity that neither Maggie nor Andrew could ignore. What had begun as cautious encounters grew into something more steady, though Maggie still held her guard high, unwilling to let herself believe in promises too easily broken. Andrew continued to show up, not with gifts or grand gestures but with patience, with time, with a willingness to be present in moments that most men in his position would have considered beneath them. He walked Lily to school when Maggie worked early shifts, sat through her dance recitals where he clapped the loudest even when she stumbled through her steps, and learned how to braid her hair though his fingers fumbled clumsily. Each act chipped away at the image of the man Maggie had once known, replacing it with someone she barely recognized, someone softer, humbler, and undeniably human. Maggie's heart resisted, but Lily's did not. The little girl adored him with the unquestioning faith only a child could give. She told him about her dreams of becoming an artist, drew pictures of the three of them holding hands beneath a bright sun, and called him Daddy without hesitation, as though the years of absence had never existed. Every time Andrew heard the word, he felt both joy and pain, joy for what he had been given, pain for what he had missed. At night, he would sit alone in his penthouse, staring at the drawings she pressed into his hands, and feel the walls of his empire closing in, suffocating him with the reminder that none of it mattered if he could not keep this fragile connection alive. Maggie struggled most with trust. She saw the way Andrew looked at Lily, the awe and tenderness in his gaze, and part of her wanted to believe he had changed. Yet another part, the scarred part, remembered the man who had dismissed her with a single sentence, leaving her to bear the weight of motherhood alone. She told herself she would not forgive him, not fully, because forgiveness felt like erasing the years of pain she had endured. But late at night, when she watched Lily asleep in her bed and thought of the smile her daughter now carried because of Andrew's presence, she wondered if perhaps forgiveness wasn't about forgetting but about letting go. The breakthrough came unexpectedly one Sunday afternoon. Maggie invited Andrew to join them for a picnic in the park, a tentative gesture that surprised even her. They spread a blanket beneath a tree while Lily chased butterflies in the grass. For the first time, it felt almost natural, almost like a family, though Maggie kept her eyes guarded. At one point, Andrew turned to her, his voice quiet, stripped of pride. "I can never give back the years I stole from you, Maggie. I can never erase the night I told you that lie. But I need you to know, I think about it every day, and I hate the man I was. If you never forgive me, I'll understand. But I will not stop showing up for her, for you, until my last breath." Something in his voice broke through the armor Maggie had built. She saw no manipulation there, no arrogance. Only truth, raw and trembling. For the first time in years, she let herself truly look at him, not as the CEO who had cast her aside but as a man who was trying, faltering, desperate to make amends. She felt tears sting her eyes, but she did not turn away. Instead, she whispered, "You said I had the wrong address. But maybe it was you who didn't know where home was." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and for a moment, neither of them breathed. Lily ran back then, her small arms full of flowers, and climbed onto Andrew's lap as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He held her, his eyes wet, and Maggie realized that the decision she had feared making had already been made. The past could not be rewritten, but the future stretched before them like an open road. It would not be perfect, it would not erase the scars, but it could be theirs. That night, after Andrew walked them home, Maggie stood in the doorway as Lily slept inside. She turned to him, her expression soft but steady. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she said. He met her gaze, his voice quiet but certain. "I'm not promising perfection. I'm promising presence." And for the first time, she believed him. In the months that followed, Andrew learned that love was not a deal to be struck or a title to be claimed. It was messy, exhausting, humbling, and it demanded far more than he had ever given. Yet it also gave back more than he had imagined. He laughed with Lily until his sides ached, sat with Maggie through long nights of fear and doubt, and discovered that his empire meant nothing compared to the small apartment that now felt like the only place where he truly belonged. The man who once declared she had the wrong address finally found his way home, and the woman who had carried the weight of rejection alone finally let herself lay it down. Together, with their daughter's laughter as the thread that bound them, they built something stronger than pride, stronger than regret. They built a family.